Jinx and Finn were standing in the clearing surrounded by a circle of trees and bushes, cutting them off from the town, from Shady's place, from help. There was a rustle of leaves and a loud snap in the distance, but no one came. It must have been a coon or a badger getting caught in a hunter's trap. Every creature had a basic instinct for survival, but for that poor critter, there was no getting away. Jinx's own survival instincts were charged. He knew he wasn't going back with Finn. "I'll tell them. I'll turn myself in and tell them it was an accident, and I'll tell them you were there." Finn nodded. For a second, Jinx thought he might actually leave. Then, in one swift movement, Finn grabbed Jinx, twisted him around, and shoved the gun into his back. Well, now that would be a lie, because it wasn't no accident. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I killed him on purpose. I put the knife in your hand so you'd wake up with it. You should have known you didn't do it, boy. You don't have the guts." Jinx felt a flood of relief, which was quickly followed by anger. "Let me go." "I can't. Junior threatened me, and he had it coming. And now you threatened me. This'll make things real simple. I'll tell the sheriff it was you that killed Junior, and when I said I was going to turn you in, there was a fight and—" Finn cocked the gun. "Well, you can see how things will turn out from there. Move into those trees." Jinx struggled to get away, but Finn held firm. Darkness surrounded them as they entered the thick grove of trees encircling the clearing. Jinx walked forward a few paces, then stopped, not able to see where he was going. Then he sensed a movement just in front of them. He could tell by the way Finn's body tensed behind his that he heard something. They both backed up a step, then another, as a dark figure moved towards them. There was a faint rattling sound. The figure moved in an eerie, flowing way as it drove them back towards the clearing. Jinx felt Finn's grip loosen. Then he heard a loud snap. He was free. He could get away. But before he could turn around, the gun went off. Jinx felt pain cut through him for only an instant. Then he fell and the world went dark. The following afternoon was warm and aglow, with the oranges and reds and yellows of fall leaves. Most of the manifest townspeople could be found strolling the grounds of the homecoming celebration, enjoying these days of Indian summer. But everyone knew that an Indian summer could only last so long. A lot of things could only last so long. That afternoon also found 3 men who stood around an open grave, the same open grave Jinx and Shady had used the day before for their prank on Sheriff Dean. Shady, Donald McGregor, and Hadley Gillen lowered the casket 6 feet down. Sheriff Dean and Sheriff Nagelman approached the gravesite just as Shady was finishing his few words of eulogy. "And Lord, we ask your blessing on this soul, who was with us such a short time. May he rest in peace." Then Donald lifted a shovel to begin replacing the earth into the grave. Miss Sadie's Divining Parlor, August 23rd, 1936. "What?" I cried. "That can't be right. You've got the story wrong." Hot tears filled my eyes and my words sputtered out all angry and sad, like water sizzling on a hot tin pan. "Jinx didn't die. He grew up and lived a life and had a daughter, me." I didn't say the last part out loud, but that was the thread I'd been weaving throughout the summer. I'd come to know Jinx in a way I didn't even know my own father, who was so far away. It had been such a consolation to me to get wrapped up in Jinx's story, to grow to love him and care about him, to wish and hope that maybe he'd grow up and become my daddy, that he was loyal and faithful and true, and he'd never leave his daughter behind. But if Jinx was gone, then he couldn't be Gideon, and that meant I'd lost Gideon all over again. I was alone again. Miss Sadie just kept rocking, waiting for me to sort through things on my own. What was it she had said earlier? The line between truth and myth is sometimes difficult to see. Was that all this had been, a myth, just a tale from long ago that didn't have anything to do with me? I knew the choice in front of me. I could walk out of that divining parlor right then and be done with it all. I could leave Miss Sadie behind and never come back. But I knew these people, Jinx and Ned and Velma T, Shady and Hattie Mae, even Miss Larkin. They'd become a part of me, and I loved them. What else had Miss Sadie said? Who would dream that one can love without being crushed under the weight of it? I stiffened my back and sat up straight. The story was about real people who had lived and loved, and in some way I'd been allowed into their world, and they had welcomed me. The only way I could give back was to be faithful to the story. To hear it to the end, I would be faithful, even if it crushed me. Miss Sadie sensed my resolve and picked up where she left off. Donald lifted a shovel to begin replacing the earth into the grave. St. Desire, October 27, 1918. Wait, Nagelman said, holding up a hand. He looked at the gravestone that lay flat on the ground. This isn't his name. Shady spoke up. It's his given name. Nobody's born with a name like Jinx. Sheriff Nagelman looked skeptical. He motioned to Sheriff Dean. Make sure it's the kid. The manifest sheriff took McDonald's shovel and lifted the lid of the coffin. He gazed down with intent, looking right into the dead face of Finn Bennett, and wondered at his missing foot. Shady, Donald, and Hadley looked at one another in defeat. They hadn't anticipated anyone's opening the coffin. Sheriff Dean's jaw clamped tightly onto his toothpick. He rubbed his whiskers and studied the body. Then he closed the lid, handed the shovel back to Donald, and said firmly, "That's him." "Good enough," said Sheriff Nagelman, brushing his hands as if he had just taken out the trash. He offered up his hand to Sheriff Dean. "I guess things worked out for the best." "I'd say so," Sheriff Dean answered, arms folded. "Right." Sheriff Nagelman withdrew his unshaken hand and left. As soon as Sheriff Nagelman was a fair distance away, Shady, Hadley, and Donald let out a collective breath. Then they all set their uncomprehending eyes on Sheriff Dean. "Where's the boy?" Sheriff Dean asked. "He's back at my place, resting," said Shady. "Gunshot went through his shoulder and he blacked out for a time. He's being tended to. It should be fine." Sheriff Dean motioned to the coffin. "And who's the stiff?" "He's the one who really killed that fellow in Joplin and tried to blame it on Jinx. He came after the boy and got spooked by something. Stepped into one of Louver Thomason's coon traps, and then fell back and hit his head on a rock. I wouldn't wish such an end on anybody, but the man was a bad seed." Sheriff Dean thought for a moment. "That explains the missing foot. Still in the trap, I expect?" Again, Shady, Hadley, Donald stared dumbfounded at the sheriff. He seemed to enjoy their confession and eventually removed the toothpick from his mouth. "I may not be the most straightforward and narrow sheriff in town, but last time I checked, I'm the only sheriff in town. And no cocky city sheriff's going to come in and run the show." He replaced the toothpick in his mouth. "I'd best be getting along. Shady, that libation you gave me yesterday isn't setting too well with my constitution," he said, and walked off. After a full minute of the three men watching the sheriff leave and looking back and forth at one another, Donald shook his head and said, "Well, I never." To which the other two responded, "Never." Then Donald began shoveling dirt into the open grave while Shady read aloud the verse that had been engraved onto the tombstone. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The first annual homecoming celebration began without a hitch. Most people knew nothing of the nighttime escapade or the unusual burial that had taken place that day. They just milled from one booth to another, sampling each other's fine foods, clapping and cheering for their favorites in the sack races, the egg toss, the bonsai tournament, which ended in a draw between the Italians and the Scots, because the hedge apples kept splitting open. As the day turned into night and soft music began, the gentlemen of Manifest took their ladies' hands and escorted them into the open-air dance floor lit by a canopy of electric lights. Jinx sat to the side of the stage, his shoulder in a bandage and sling. Shady brought him a glass of punch. Together they watched children scampering about with glowing faces and eventually nodding off in their mother's arms. Ivan Devore stole glances at Velma T. across the dance floor as he worked up the nerve to ask her to dance. Hadley Gillen was on stage playing first trumpet in the band. Hattie Mae, with no pen or paper in hand, looked splendid in pink chiffon dress as she danced a waltz with Mr. Frank Mackey. Pearl Ann, home from college, served punch while Miss Larkin held court with a bevy of women. The ladies listened with rapt attention to the story of how Miss Larkin and the boy Jinx had cooked up the scheme of tricking Lester Burton into buying the springs, and how it had been her idea not to tell anyone, including Shady, of their plans. Miss Larkin had done some theater work in high school. She had, in fact, played the lead in the senior class production of All on Account of Polly, and was confident she could pull off her part, but felt they'd get a better performance out of Shady if he was unapprised. People were smiling, especially Mr. Sabulski, who sat to the side of the dance floor, holding a healthy new baby boy. The whole town was filled with hope and promise that the hard times were behind them, until the army truck pulled in. At first people thought it was just a latecomer to the dance, but when the young man, dressed in a crisp brown uniform, stepped out of his automobile, they knew otherwise. The music died out with a painful moan. The soldier made his way into the crowd. He showed a paper to Mr. Manipatopoulos, who motioned toward the band platform. Hadley stood, waiting for the news. "Are you Mr. Hadley Gillen?" the soldier asked. Hadley nodded. The man spoke a few quiet words and handed Hadley an envelope. Hadley held the envelope for a moment and then passed it to Shady. "Read it, Shady, to all of us." Shady read, "Regret to inform you, your son, Ned Gillen, was killed in action, October 8th. Stop. His body recovered in Argonne region, South France. Stop. Laid to rest in St. Dizier. Stop. Personal effects to follow. Stop." A deadly silence became the music that reverberated throughout. The town of Manifest had loved Ned Gillen, and now the town of Manifest was crushed under the weight of that love. But the boy Jinx, it buried him.